So, Mr. President, we can go back and forth and blame each other. But in the recent history of the vacancy caused by Justice Scalia's death, we both lost. We lost Merrick Garland because of the majority leader's unprecedented blockade. And Republicans will lose on Judge Gorsuch because we're doing something that we think is reasonable in asking he be able to earn 60 votes, as so many others have. We think the two are not equivalent. But in either case, we both lost. We're back to square one, and Republicans have total freedom of choice in this situation. No one is forcing them to break the rules. They don't have to treat the nuclear option as if it's their first and only option. It's a false choice. To my friends on the other side, the answer isn't to change the rules. The answer is to change the nominees. Presidents of both parties have done so in the past when Supreme Court picks failed to merit confirmation. Again, the answer isn't to change the rules. The answer is to change the nominee. The majority leader should have the vision and courage to see past this impasse, and I believe he should seriously consider a different option. The President, Senate Republicans, and Democrats should sit down together to come up with a mainstream nominee who can earn bipartisan support. We're willing to meet with them anywhere, anytime, to discuss a consensus nominee. Now, I know my colleagues on the other side will say Judge Gorsuch was a mainstream nominee, and Democrats would never support any judge nominated by President Trump. We disagree. We probably can't support any nominee that's whose sole vetting is by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. They were the sole gatekeepers for the Scalia vacancy, and each is well known to be a right-wing, wealthy, special interest group dedicated to moving the bench way to the right. Their selection of Judge Gorsuch shows it. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post did analyses done by experts that showed that Judge Gorsuch would be a very, very conservative, many would say right-wing justice on the bench. The New York Times said he'd be the second most conservative justice on the bench, second only to Justice Thomas, and more conservative than the late Justice Scalia. And the Washington Post actually said he'd be the most conservative justice on the bench based on his record, even more conservative than the very, very conservative Justice Thomas. In fact, we Democrats have never let special interest groups be the gatekeeper. We have said to any special interest group, we have never said to any special interest group, as President Trump did, give us a list, we'll choose from that list. That's what Republicans did. We have never done it. And in the past, presidents have done just what we're suggesting for selecting Supreme Court justices. President Bill Clinton sought and took the advice of Republican Judiciary Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch in nominating Justices Ginsburg and Breyer instead of Bruce Babbitt. President Obama took the advice of Republican senators when he picked Merrick Garland, a consensus mainstream nominee. President Trump, on the other hand, ignored the Senate and only sought the advice and consent of right-wing special interest groups when making Supreme Court picks. He was running. He had to shore up his support on the hard right. So he said, I am outsourcing the entire selection process to two groups who, again, are not consensus groups. They would admit that themselves. The Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society. Lo and behold, the process didn't produce a nominee who could earn 60 votes. By contrast, Justice Ginsburg earned 93 votes. Justice Breyer earned 87. So, Mr. President, we're offering President Trump and our friends on the other side a way forward. They don't have to break the rules to get a justice on the bench. They don't have to break the Senate confirmation process, fundamentally weakening the constitutional principle of advise and consent to get a justice on the bench. The President Trump, could simply consult with members of both parties to try and come up with a consensus nominee who could get approved and meet a 60-vote threshold. The answer, again, isn't to change the rules, it's to change the nominee. And we Democrats are not going to oppose every Republican nominee. Of course, we realize a nominee selected this way would not completely agree with our views, but Judge Gorsuch is so far out of the mainstream, he isn't able to earn votes to pass the Senate. Even Justices Roberts and Alito, two very conservative judges, earned a bunch of Democratic votes and each got more than 60, one in his nomination, the other 72 votes in the cloture process. So, Mr. President, the Republicans are free actors. They can choose to go nuclear, or they can sit down with Democrats and find a way forward that preserves the grand traditions of this body. The Majority Leader himself has said, the one thing the two leaders have always agreed upon is to protect the integrity of this institution. He continued, I think we can stipulate, he has said, and this is a direct quote, that in the Senate it takes 60 votes on controversial matters. Mitch McConnell, in the Senate it takes 60 votes on controversial matters. And he has long stood for that proposition for the many years I've been here. A Supreme Court seat, I believe, meets the Majority Leader's standard for 60 votes. And I hope, instead of crippling the Senate in a partisan way, removing that 60-vote threshold for controversial matters like the Supreme Court, my Republican friends consider the option of working together to find a solution we can both accept. It may seem like a novel concept around here, but that option is always on the table. Thank you, and I yield the floor.